Podcasts on UNC-TV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.
What is a moral hazard?
Jeff Foxworthy actually has a routine about it. He talks about how whenever he goes to get a rental car, he buys the full coverage insurance, everything. You wreck the car, no matter what it is, you just walk away, you get in another one. He says, because when I do that, I can drive like a wild man, right? Well, that's moral hazard. The idea is that when you separate essentially the cost associated with risky behavior from the person engaging in the behavior, you're going to get additional risky behavior. You're going to essentially subsidize risky behavior and get more of it than you should.
We're talking about bankers giving money to private individuals.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of parties involved in this. So who's conducting the risky behavior?
Well, it's on both sides, actually, because it's been subsidized on both sides. What has happened is that borrowers have gone out and borrowed much more than they could ultimately afford. And banks have been perfectly willing to make those loans. A lot of it has to do with interest rates being kept low by the Federal Reserve, federal government policies that have essentially told banks that you need to get everybody into a house, regardless of whether they can afford it or not. So it was working from both sides. So both the lenders and the borrowers have been engaging in excessively risky behavior.
There are consumer advocates out there
Mm-hmm.
who say borrowers didn't know what they were getting into. They just wanted a home. They acted in good faith, and they were taken advantage of. You buy it?
Well, and it's possible to some degree that that's true. On the other hand, it's rather paternalistic, if you ask me. It says, well, these people are stupid, the banks are smart, and people just went out and got loans that they couldn't afford. And it's very enticing when you have a situation where you can go in and borrow 100%,
no down payment,
no down payment at all, and not have to consider the long-term risk. Now, the problem is if you bail these people out, to get back to moral hazard, what you are essentially doing is you are, like getting the full insurance, you are telling people, not just the people who borrowed the money in the first place, but others, that we are going to separate your choices and the risk of your choices from having to bear the costs of those risks. So it sends a general message to markets, both borrowers and lenders, to continue with this kind of process, and when in fact we have to be pulling back from that. What we have to do is start to encourage people to make prudent choices with respect to the risks they take, and also on the bank's parts to make those same prudent choices.
Who defines what's a prudent choice?
Well, the market will, if it's left alone. If you allow but it's not in the bank's interest to make loans to people that they expect will be defaulted on. It makes no sense. What has happened, though, is, first of all, Federal Reserve kept interest rates very, very low. The lower the interest rate, the more risk people will take.
That's good. I've heard that's good.
What, lower interest rates?
Sure.
Well, not if those interest rates do not reflect actual market conditions, and that was the problem. So that was one issue. The other issue has to do with the way the federal government encouraged banks to make risky loans. I don't know if you remember, maybe a decade or so, we had this whole redlining issue, and it was said, well, banks are not making loans in certain areas to people. And the bank's response was, these are very risky loans. And if you look at them, and if people did look at them actuarially at the time, it made sense not to make these loans. But essentially, they were attacked by special interest groups and so on, saying, basically, if you don't make these loans, we're going to sue you for discrimination, for what was called redlining. And so banks capitulated and started making very risky loans.
What about loans that were underwritten through mortgage brokers that were the purpose of the mortgage was to be an investment for someone overseas in a bond or some sort of
Oh yeah,
security?
yeah. I mean, there's lots of issues related to this, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac took because banks knew that they would be able to basically pawn off these risky loans onto Fannie and Freddie, who were, by the way, guaranteed, right, by the taxpayer. Again, a moral hazard, right? If you're pulling the risk out of these loans for the banks, then yeah, I mean, there was a whole lot of things that came together, but so much of it relates back to this idea that in lots of different, from lots of different directions, you had risk-taking, excessive risk-taking being subsidized.
For example, let's say neighbor A receives a mortgage modification because they can't afford the mortgage. What lesson do they learn if someone steps in, modifies that mortgage to keep them in their home and keep them making the payment at a reduced level?
Well, it depends on who that someone is. If it's the government saying we're going to do that with taxpayer-backed money, that's one thing, and I would argue that shouldn't be done. That truly is a subsidy. If the bank does it because it says, look, it looks at its cost and benefits, it's costly for banks to foreclose and then have to turn around and go out and try to sell it, maybe repair the house, whatever. If the bank looks at that situation and says, well, it makes more sense for us to modify that loan, restructure it, and keep them there than it does to foreclose on them, then that is I would argue, a decision that makes sense.
A private decision.
Right, a private decision that makes, right.
But neighbor B over here has cut off the cable, sold the new car, got an old clunker.
Mm-hmm.
They're scraping by to make that house payment,
right,
and don't want the mortgage modification. What do you say to them if that happens next door?
I'd say to them, look, this is a private contractual relationship between your neighbor and their bank. If your bank isn't willing to make that same arrangement, well, you know, maybe you negotiated with the wrong bank. I don't know what their particular situation is. But how much worse would it be if you said to that person, I am going to tax you. You are responsible. You are making your payments. You're doing what you have to do. And I am going to tax you and take that money and bail out your neighbor with essentially your money. I mean, that is the true injustice.
Is it insensitive for that neighbor who's current, who has cut back, watching their spending, to feel animosity towards someone in the neighborhood?
Well, I'm an economist, not a psychologist, but
well, you'd think for a living.
But it's understandable. Whether it's insensitive or not, I can't say. People have you know, interpersonal feelings, mm-hmm. and there's really not much you can do about that. People are there's going to be jealousies and that sort of thing. But I think it is very understandable.
Chris Kukla of the Center for Responsible Lending had a conversation with me on camera, and he says, at the end of the day, you want your neighbor to get some assistance to keep them in their home, because it's more risky to have an empty foreclosed house down the street from you than to have someone who's been, quote, bailed out. Do you see that argument?
It very well may be the case that for him, but so what you're saying is the government is subsidizing other people in the neighborhood, and
saves my equity. My property value won't drop. Yeah. There's no auction at the courthouse square.
And someone may very well be happy about the fact that their neighbor got that bailout because of it, but it doesn't change the argument that when you do that, it also increases the possibility and the probability that other people going into markets mm-hmm. to borrow money are going to take, because they think, well, you know, okay, so if I can't pay the payments, I'll get bailed out too, okay? I will take more risk than I would otherwise take.
Do you think people who face adverse situations, like the topic we're speaking, they don't learn their lesson? Or they do learn their lesson?
I think they do. I think people learn. look, you know, if they didn't, then I would argue markets don't work, because markets are all about trial and error. People make mistakes in markets. Businesses make mistakes. They make investments that go south, and if they don't get bailed out, they take the losses, learn their lessons, and change their investment strategies. So no, I think people learn, but they don't learn if you don't give them an incentive to learn. In other words, what encourages the learning process is bearing the costs.
Which would be maybe losing your house if you're irresponsible. And if you're a bank, losing a loan.
No, that's absolutely right. And look, you know, we're talking about this now because there've been so many foreclosures at once, but there's been foreclosures for, you know, forever, as long as there's been home mortgage loans, right? So the idea that people may not be able to make their payments and may have to have their house foreclosed upon is nothing new. It's just that, and we weren't talking about bailing people out 10, 15 years ago that happened to. We're talking about it now because there's this big cluster of essentially market errors that took place, and I would argue because of a bunch of bad policies. They're all taking place at once.
What happens to our state economy in terms of housing, real estate sales, if widespread mortgage modifications occur and foreclosures are delayed and avoided?
If banks are in there trying to restructure loans with people to essentially, because it makes sense for them to do that, I think that's fine. And what we're seeing is, in that case, the market internalizing these risks that were being taken. On the other hand, if we're talking about, say, the state comes in and bails people out, or the federal government does it, then I think you're just delaying an inevitable retrenchment in the real estate market. I don't. I think what happens then when the bank does it, it looks at the person's sort of longer term situation. But if it thinks, well, I'm just delaying it 6 months, it's probably not going to do it. But the government's view on that is going to be different, because eventually we have to come to terms with people essentially accurately assessing their risk, and banks accurately assessing their risk and matching those things up.
$151 million is going to come into this state to help people avoid foreclosure while they retrain, while they get back on their feet. That's tax money. If the market were allowed to crash, how would it affect a potential recovery versus if we delay a lot of this?
You used the word crash. I would use the word readjust, okay? Because that's what it means, right? And the question is, I think when you have market readjustments that need to take place, the best thing is for them to happen as soon as possible and move on. That's why I believe, for example, that all the bailouts that took place in 2008, if we hadn't done that, all that did was prolong agony, and that we'd be in much better shape right now if we didn't do it. In other words, I think the readjustment process in markets needs to take place as quickly as possible, and so many policies delay them.